This is a concept paper. What I wanted to look at was how public-private partnerships can aid in the development process, particularly in developing countries. Okay, so I wanted to take a look at that. So a public-private partnership has been defined just as a cooperation between the public government sector and private enterprise. Typically, these partnerships have been used for infrastructure, railways, water systems, utilities, etc. In the US, athletics, particularly our version of football, is very popular and a very big business. So the owners of the football teams, wanting to attract large numbers of people, have built these beautiful stadiums that are extremely costly. The Dallas Cowboys Stadium, I think, was close to $1 billion. I think the new Giant Stadium, or the New York Giants, although the stadium is in New Jersey, so I refer to them as the New Jersey Giants, but the stadium built there at the Meadowlands was over $1 billion. And that a private enterprise couldn't do that, so a public-private partnership did that, and tends to work. But is there a way to use these partnerships to provide economic development in some less than developed countries? Here's a graph in developing countries over the last 20 years, how much money has been spent in public-private partnerships. And as you can see, most of it is in energy, transportation, water, and communication. So it's for those kind of goods that public-private partnerships have put their money. Now, I have to say too, I'm trained as a free market economist. So just the idea of this kind of seems to rub me the wrong way. But putting that aside, I took a look at it and thought maybe there's a way that the public sector and the private sector could work together. Now, there are a number of examples in European countries of government-owned companies. I know Alitalia Airline in Italy, which I think has gone bankrupt, was government-sponsored. Airbus is doing very well, and that's got a lot of government control. Typically, any kind of public investment was usually in the form of debt. In other words, they lent the money, and the money was to be repaid. That's always the way it was in the US. Then in 2008 and 2009, in the US, there were some things done that hadn't been done before. There were some very large companies, which the American public eventually said are too big to fail. And the federal government bailed them out, but not by lending them the money. The US government took an equity position in these companies. Some of it has turned out well. AIG, which was the big reinsurer of mortgages, and when the financial crisis hit, they went down hard. The US government invested in them, took a stock position. AIG recovered, repaid it, and the US government, because they owned stock and they bought it at a low price, when the company recovered, they sold it and they actually made a profit on that. General Motors was the opposite. There was large amounts of capital put in there. The US government hasn't gotten out of that yet, but it looks like it's going to cost the taxpayers in the $20 billion range. Okay, so the US government, for the first time, invested in large companies taking an equity position rather than a debt position. So the first thing I did was I started to examine all the literature on public-private partnerships to try to determine what are some of the factors that led to these partnerships being successful, so that if we're going to come up with some idea on how to construct these in developing countries, we can take a look at some of these factors. First of all, the venture needs a very specific plan, exactly what they're going to do and when they're going to do it. A firm commitment from the private entrepreneur who's involved, and the public has to be there. And we need open communication and trust. And that is somewhat of an issue, I think, especially the communication part. I've been an entrepreneur myself, and I know when I was dealing with banks, if something didn't go quite right, rather than tell the lender and get them a little bit upset, the first inclination was, well, let me fix this, and after I fix it, the problem will go away. So you need really more open communication. Even if things aren't going well, the sooner everybody knows about it, the better. The fourth thing up there is a willingness to compromise. I think the unwillingness to compromise in a lot of areas in economics is causing problems. So here, in business, you come up with a good business plan on what you're going to do in the coming years. I teach a course in entrepreneurship, and the first thing I say to them is, as soon as the business plan's finished and you're ready to look at it, it's essentially become obsolete. And the reason is so many things change that you just didn't think about. So because of that, both sides are going to need a willingness to compromise and try to work out solutions. The community should be involved in this too. When we say that the government is putting money in, the government really doesn't have any of its own money. The government money comes from taxpayers. So you're really talking about taxpayers here, members of the community, and they should be aware of what's happening. Politically, you need support from the government. Each venture should have as much expertise as possible, so you need that expert advice. If you're going into business, you're dealing with an uncertain condition, and as a result of that, there's risk. So you want to try to assess the risk and make both sides aware of exactly what the risk is. Clearly define roles for what the private entrepreneur will do and the government's position need to be developed, and a mutual respect between all parties. So those are the things that in the past have led to successful public-private partnerships. Now, the issue of corruption is a problem. Whenever the government seems to get involved in things, there's always a tendency, as we've said in the last couple of papers, for people wanting to line their pockets rather than doing what they're supposed to do. This comes from political officials. It's done very serious damage. Someone just set up here all the aid dollars that have gone to the countries that were studied really didn't seem to promote much economic growth. So the corruption problem has to be dealt with, particularly I think in developing countries. With a lot of corruption, that's going to discourage investment from coming in. So again, we need to eliminate that. Corruption undermines social welfare, slows the development process, etc. Okay, now, suppose we're going to set up a public-private partnership in a developing country. I said to myself, why is it that developing countries are so slow to develop? Well, if you take a look at the inputs into the economy, traditionally we say land, labor, capital, and enterprise, really breaks down to capital and labor, as well as somebody to figure out how to do all this, the entrepreneur. Well, in less than developed countries, there's plenty of labor. It may not be of the skill level that we like, but there is plenty of labor available. We can train people and educate people on how to run businesses and be entrepreneurs. I'm involved in looking at business incubators, for instance, and that kind of thing really helps. Where the developing countries come up short is in the area of capital. So I thought, if we come up with some kind of a government agency that uses taxpayers' funds, this agency could invest in new companies, taking an equity position in the new companies in order to facilitate growth. Now, if you do that, there's a couple, 3 or 4 decisions that have to be made. How would you structure this agency that's going to monitor the funding? That has to be looked at. And then if the taxpayers are going to take an equity position in companies, which specific industries and markets should we look at? Then there are going to be many entrepreneurs who want to do this, so somehow you have to decide which entrepreneurs to fund and which not. And I believe this should be set up for short term. Just get the company up and running and then get the government out and let them run themselves. So you need an exit strategy going into this. So how do we minimize corruption? Well, if this agency was set up and run by somebody who was elected by the people, perhaps for a 4-year term, then if something wasn't going quite right with somebody, it's not a government appointee or a crony, it's somebody who has to run for re-election. And you could probably set some term limits on this and things like that. That would have to be worked out. But the agency should be monitored by somebody who is elected by the population. Secondly, you need complete transparency. So the agency says, these are the markets we're going to invest in. I'll talk about that in a minute. And there's certain criteria that we're going to judge each entrepreneur. And this can be put on a website. The new agency said, we're going to invest so much money in this person. Here's the reason why we're doing it. We have a certain set of criteria. Here's how this person measures up to that criteria. He came out higher than anybody else, so we're going to invest in him. And again, it has to be transparent so that the public can see why each decision was made, and the funds just didn't go to somebody who happened to be a friend of somebody else. The government investment should always be a minority position, so that the entrepreneur owns more than 50%. That gives him incentive. It's essentially my company, he would say. That gives him incentive. And when decisions have to be made, while you want to consult with your partner, as you often do, if there's any kind of a disagreement in direction, I think it should go to what the entrepreneur wants to do rather than what the government wants to do. Now, which industries do you invest in? Now, this was a tough one to come up with, but I took a look at individuals and countries have certain needs that have to be satisfied. Abe Maslow, many years ago, came up with his hierarchy of needs, which is very well known. So if countries are worried about their basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, those are the kind of businesses you should invest in first. Once that's satisfied, then you can invest in businesses that work on higher level needs. The only caveat to that is that if a country has some kind of resource or some specialty that they can do as good or better than other countries and it will lead to exports, exports lead to building the wealth of a nation. So look at industries by hierarchy of needs and look at industries based on their ability to perhaps export and raise additional money that way. Now the next thing, which entrepreneurs do you invest in? If a program like this came out, I have a feeling there'd be people all over the place wanting to get in this, which is a good thing because you want to get as many businesses going. We talk about sustainable development. To really get sustainable development, you need a strong business sector. So the business sector can provide jobs that will reduce the unemployment rate, and as the unemployment rate is reduced, the economy then can grow. So which entrepreneurs do you fund? Well, if you have somebody that has a lot of experience versus somebody who's never done this before, you're more likely to be successful, or at least increase the probability of success by investing in an entrepreneur that has experience in what he's doing. Perhaps we require that an entrepreneur taking these public investment funds go through a training or an incubation program. The probability of success increases significantly with companies that have been involved with business incubation. In the US, the Small Business Administration reports that 90% of small businesses tend to fail within the first 3 years. So we want to try to minimize that, and the way to minimize that is to get experienced entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs that have received some formal training. Maybe they set up shop initially in a business incubator, so some of the expertise and services that they need to help them succeed would be available. In my entrepreneurship class, I tell the students the first thing you need is a comprehensive business plan, even though when the business plan is done and you get started, it's likely to be obsolete. Because again, so many factors change that you didn't even think about, that it's likely to modify the business plan. But by going through a business plan, you'll understand the funding you have, you'll determine who the target market is, you'll determine the right product for that target market, and some kind of, usually we ask for 3 years worth of income statements and balance sheets to see if a company is going to be viable. The slide the other day, I think it was Barry's slide, showed whether it's long or short term, the first year or two companies are going to lose money, and that's just the way things are. So you need funding ahead of time so that when those losses occur, there's funds available to take care of the loss. As I tell my students, the best time to raise money is when you don't need it. The worst time to raise money is when you need it. So if you're out of funds and I can't even pay my bills, and you go to get funds at that point, even debt or equity funds, it's a very difficult position because the company is not doing very well. If, on the other hand, you anticipated this and you said, look, we need X number of dollars to get started. My business plan says I'm going to lose this much money the first year, this much money the second year. I should be profitable the third year. My total capital requirements then would not be just the startup, but also to fund the losses in the early years. So an adequate business plan is very important to help you anticipate some of the things that are going to happen. And you have to avoid this cronyism. And I know in many areas, who gets the money is dependent upon who knows who. And that's not going to work. So you need a specific set of criteria. Then when the agency decides what entrepreneurs to invest in, they'll give reasons why they did that. And it's a public agency, so that should be put on a website and anybody can see. If someone says, well, I applied, why didn't I get it? Well, you added up this way, this guy added up a little bit higher, he was viewed as less of a risk, so we went with him. Not that he's friends with somebody, but that that individual had the characteristics that would tend to minimize the chance of failure. 2 minutes. I think I only have 2 slides, so we're going well. For an exit strategy, I think the government involvement should only be about a 3 to 5 or 3 to 7 year period. By the 3rd year, you're going to pretty much know if the company's going to make it or not. By the 4th or 5th year or the 6th year, the company should be in a position that the government could then sell their equity position. If the company set up as a corporation, you simply sell the stock. If it's set up as some other type of entity, the government would then look to sell it to the private sector, thereby completely privatizing the venture. And again, I'm trained as a free market economist, so I believe that the private sector will be much more successful than doing things in the public sector. We talked about the business life cycle. In that introductory stage, you lose money typically for a year or two, then you go into the growth. So by the 4th, 5th year, you're up to that maturity level, and it's at that point I think the federal government should get out. So in conclusion, in the last 60 seconds, I think a properly structured public-private partnership can promote economic development by providing capital, particularly in developing countries. The agency set up to monitor that should be run by an elected official, has to run again for the position, and he could set some term limits. The government ownership should always be a minority position, less than 50%, so the entrepreneur knows it's his company, he's got a partner, but it's essentially his company. Will select markets based on the need level of the population, or if there's some commodity that can be exported. The specific entrepreneurs then that we're going to invest in will be based on their experience level and training that they have, and how they prepared a successful business plan. And lastly, this is a short-term venture for the government agency, so an exit strategy has to be developed.